We are back on the Zero Hour. Our next guest is going to be talking with us about a historic political milestone, an unexpected development in the world of politics and finance. Apparently, Senator Marco Rubio has a good idea. And we're going to be talking about that now with Helaine Olen. Helaine is one of my favorite writers on finance and economics. She writes about what she describes as the intersection of money and life, politics, economics, workplace culture, and women's issues. She's written for a number of prominent publications. She's the author of the books Pound Foolish, Exposing the Dark Side of the Personal Finance Industry, and The Index Card, Why Personal Finance Doesn't Have to Be So Complicated. She also writes a column about the intersection of money at life at Slate.com called The Bills, which Helaine, in the parlance of today, might be called The Ends. But in any case, Helaine Olen, thanks for coming on the program.
Oh, thank you for having me. And this is going to be a fun one to discuss because I think I was in as much shock as anybody else to realize that Marco Rubio had a great idea about money.
Well, tell us the idea.
Okay. He proposed 2 years ago opening the federal Thrift Savings Plan to the American public. That's the workplace defined contribution retirement plan of the federal employees. I should stress federal employees also have a pension. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about basically opening up the federal equivalent of the 401k to Americans who do not have a workplace retirement plan, which is about 1/3 of all Americans. This is a fantastic idea. He made a big speech about it in 2014 and has barely discussed it since.
So is it part of his presidential platform, or has he not said one way or another?
That's a really good question. It appears to be part of his platform. When I reached out to his people last week, because I thought, interesting question, right? They told me that they pointed to a book of his, not a book, I mean a pamphlet called Reclaiming the American Dream. You can find it online. And it is mentioned on page 46. When I then asked them, gee, why hasn't Marco Rubio discussed this any further, they never responded to me.
Well, now this is a guy who is not great on the tax issue, let's say. In fact, as you point out, one of your colleagues described it as a grotesque gift to America's plutocrats. That's his tax plan. He would, as you point out, throw his own generation under the bus for Medicare and Social Security by raising the retirement age for people under 55 years of age. And we all know the story, or many of us know the stories of his own problems with personal finances. But he has this good idea, and this is, sometimes they call it the TSP, the Federal Thrift Savings Plan that you were describing. Now, why is this better than, let's say, the 401ks? I guess one way it would be better is that there are a lot of employers who don't offer savings plans, so this would be available to anybody, right?
Right. The first thing is, of course, it's a plan, right? But there's really two other things that make it much better than the average workplace 401k or 403b if you work for a nonprofit. The first is the fantastically low cost structure of it. It is roughly 0.02%. That roughly translates as $2.90 in annual expenses. I'm sorry, I misspoke. It's 0.029%. Sorry about that. That roughly translates to about $2.90 for every $10,000 invested. To give you a comparison, your workplace retirement plan is anywhere from like 0.05% of the 0.5%, which is 5 basis points, to 1 to 2%.
So that is
100, which is substantially more money. Comes out to anything from $5 to $50 to $100 for every $10,000 invested.
It comes out to more than that, doesn't it?
Yeah,
no,
it could be
it comes out
$200.
$50, isn't it? Or am I doing the math wrong in my head?
You're not doing the math wrong. I have a cold, as I told you.
Is it right?
Before,
Helaine Olen, we forgive you for the cold, and so it's actually about 15. It's the private plans started about 15 times as much and go up from there. If I'm
right.
So it's super cheap, and a couple other good things about it.
So that's the first, and I should just stress that has the potential of saving the average employee about over $100,000 in expenses over their lifetime.
Wow!
Not a substantial amount of money.
No.
The second thing is the investments are incredibly easy and well managed. There are essentially a couple of funds in there. You get to choose among them, and that's sort of it. The reason that's so important is because most 401ks offer more than a dozen funds. In fact, they can offer, I believe about this average is about 16 or so. And while that sounds wonderful, what's really going on is you're just getting a slew of high-fee managed funds, when we all know index funds do much better for people, right? That's passive funds that just invest in very low market indexes, followed by the fact that most people don't have a clue what they're doing. So instead of, making a rational choice among these, more than a dozen funds they can choose from, they'll just sit there and check off all the boxes. Or they'll just use a bond fund, or they'll put everything in one fund. Nobody will diversify. It's just sort of a mess. And the less choice you have, the better off you actually are. And also, the less choice, again, cheaper it is to manage the thing. So all in all, it's a much, much better plan. And we should actually all be in on it, not just people without one. And Marco Rubio was quite right. I mean, the way he said it was, I'm going to look up the quote that I pulled here. He actually said, the twisted irony is that members of Congress who are employees of the citizens of the United States have access to a superior savings plan, while many of their employers, the American people, are left with no access at all.
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
Well, we're talking with a finance writer and writer about many other things, Helaine Olen, about Marco Rubio's good idea of making the federal thrift savings plan open to the public. I mean, we're talking about the 1/3 of all employees who don't have this plan or any kind of retirement plan, rather. But I would think this would be something that even if you've got an employer-sponsored plan, it's much cheaper, much simpler. So therefore much more efficient. Why wouldn't, it could be like a public option, like the public option was in healthcare, that if you don't like your employer's plan, why can't everybody, why don't we make it a proposal that, I guess I should start by asking, did Marco Rubio do this, but why don't we make this a proposal that anybody, whether they have an employer plan or not, can get in on this if they want to?
Well, I should say Marco Rubio never even introduced formal legislation about this. Who has introduced similar formal legislation in the past month is Jeff Merkley, the Democratic senator from Oregon. Now, what he did was not open up the federal thrift savings plan, but instead set up a parallel system to it for people who lack access to workplace plans, or is proposing to set that up, I should say. And I'll explain why in a second. Now, his plan would cost about 0.2%, and the reason for that would be because the federal thrift savings plan does have some built-in economies of scale that are not available to others, right? They have all the federal workers in one place. The federal government is probably taking some of the cost in on itself. So the federal unions were not totally happy about Rubio's proposal. However, they were not what was important here, really. They're wonderfully important, but not in this arena in terms of this. Why Rubio hasn't pushed forward. What seems to have happened is the assortment of financial industry people stepped forward and basically said this is unacceptable. That includes outfits like the Investment Company Institute, which is the lobbying arm of the mutual fund industry. They're the ones who make their money promoting 401ks, right, and these high fee structures. So what happened is they stepped forward and basically said that, quote, the biggest risk in adding millions of Americans I'm sorry. This was the Heritage Foundation said this. The biggest risk in that adding millions of Americans to the TSP would crowd out private sector retirement accounts. The private retirement sector is very innovative, constantly improving its services at lower costs to employers and employees.
Well, that last statement is factually easy enough to factually disprove. We know it's not at lower cost. I guess the other thing that, and I want to clarify this for myself as well as for the listeners, Helaine Olen, is that to me, when people talk about the private plans and the annual fees being much higher and so on, that's not all. I think each of these funds also has embedded within it fees that they charge that can be very substantial too. So you're right. So
right, it's really hard to figure out the exact fees.
But it's very high, and one of the advantages of a federal plan is not only that it has lower administrative fees, but I would assume there's much more competitive bidding. Here's what I don't get about the Merkley proposal, and trust me, I want our listeners to understand that at least in my view, Jeff Merkley is a heck of a lot better representative of the public interest than Marco Rubio by and large. But that said, I don't understand. His plan seems to charge more. If the thing about economies of scale is they don't get worse if you add more people; they get better. So I don't understand why it can't just be combined with the current thrift savings plan.
What seems to be going on, and I don't want to speak for Merkley or Merkley's office, so I should stress all this, is that the federal unions really were not happy when Rubio spoke out about this. The federal unions came to feel that adding the rest of us to this great plan would run up the cost for their own members because they would have to track people. There would be more people coming in.
I see. Okay. So enrollment and that sort of thing. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And secondarily, that the federal government is subsidizing some of the costs. That's of course why it's a little less expensive. Now, this gets a little beyond the scope of my article, but you could make an argument that, again, why don't all of us deserve this, right? We are citizens here, right? It's our government. But Merkley's plan seemed to be a way around this issue of not setting the unions off against it. And to be fair, as it is it's going to be pretty hard to get through. As we all know, you probably can't get anything through Congress right now. But there is substantial financial services opposition to this. And you're seeing that in other states. Some of the states are trying to do similar ideas, most notably California. And there's been a lot of opposition to this for the reasons we just discussed, that this is much, much, much less expensive than the financial services industry offerings in your 401k and has the potential to either force those costs down as they need to remain more competitive, or alternately, people will just say, the heck with this, and, go transfer over there.
Right, which makes sense. I guess one of the reasons why I think this is an important story, Helaine Olen, is that, well, one is because it's something that would affect a lot of people in their retirement, so that makes it important. But secondly, because I think on a larger scale, it illustrates for me, and I'm curious your thoughts, but my personal reaction to the story is it illustrates once again that there are certain things that government can do well, that government can do more efficiently because of the economies of scale and because of the fact that you don't have to factor in a profit margin, or because in certain industries, such as the personal finance industry, it may be rampant profiteering going on. So for all of those reasons, I think it tells an important larger story, which is the story of the role of the public sector, of government, in together with the private sector in making our lives better. And what do you think of that reaction?
I absolutely agree. I would like to stress this doesn't substitute for things such as also expanding Social Security. One of the issues in retirement savings isn't just these plans, but the fact that a lot of people can't even afford to put the money in, right? So ultimately, this goes hand in hand with something like expanding Social Security so that the benefits are higher, and at the same time, making it both easier and more cost efficient for Americans to get in on a very reasonable retirement plan. The traditional thinking in retirement is the idea of the three-legged stool, that you have your personal savings, that you have Social Security. And, of course, this would be a way to buttress that.
Right, because we had that three-legged stool of personal savings, pension, and Social Security, and basically because of employer behavior and the economy at large, making it tougher for people to get by, much less save. Two of those legs have been sawed off. So if we can get one back. A very interesting story. I'm really glad you brought it up. I'll be interested in learning more about Senator Merkley's bill as well. Maybe you should write about that.
Well, I mentioned it at the end of the article, and I'm hoping to follow up on it at some point. It's really... it's really a shame that this is not getting a huge amount of attention in the campaign at this point, because retirement is such a huge issue for people.
Right.
The estimates are, as you probably know, almost half of baby boomers are not going to be able to retire with adequate replacement levels right now. And the number is for Gen Xers, who I like to remind everybody are now over the age of 50. They're not in Seattle coffee shops any longer, or if they are, they're not there at 22. They are more than half of them do not have enough money at this point. And this is going to be a real issue. And why this is not coming up as bigger in the campaign is beyond me. I think you're seeing it in small pieces where, especially on the Democratic side, where there is talk about expanding Social Security. And as you know, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders have slightly different plans about that.
Right.
But on the Republican side, with the exception, by the way, of Donald Trump, and that might explain some of his appeal, and we can talk about that for a minute. The plans right now are still this idea that Social Security is going bankrupt, and we need to raise the retirement age and cut benefits. And it's absurd. As we all know, it's not going bankrupt, and it could be easily fixed with, lifting the payroll tax cap.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to wind up. But I think, number one, the discussion of Social Security is very important on the Democratic side. The fact that Trump is an outlier there is a surprising bit of good news on the Republican side. And we do need to talk more about, beyond Social Security, how to help people set aside money for retirement. So great story. And Helaine Olen, and this was published in Slate in The Bills. And thanks for coming on the program and talking about it.
Oh, thank you for having me on.
Always a pleasure.